What if the only man to drop Jon Jones wasn't a UFC champion, but a mysterious Chechen striker who vanished from the sport at his peak? Adlan Amagov is a name whispered in gyms and forums, a fighter who dazzled with spinning kicks, wrecked future stars, and then walked away just as his star began to rise. His short, explosive MMA career left fans with more questions than answers. Why did he retire so young? What really happened behind closed doors at Jackson Wink? And how did a man with just 2 UFC fights earn the respect of legends and a spot on the Russian most wanted list? This is the story of MMA's biggest what if. Adlan Amagov was one of those rare fighters who burst onto the MMA scene with both skill and flair. A native of Chechnya, Amagov began his pro MMA career in 2007 and quickly racked up wins with an unorthodox and dangerous striking style. He finished 8 of his first 10 fights, showing off his trademark spinning techniques and powerful kicks, and even became a Unifight World and European champion before stepping into the international spotlight. He made a name for himself in Strikeforce, going 3-1 with a highlight reel KO win over Anthony Smith, a fighter who would later become a UFC title contender. His only Strikeforce loss came at the hands of Robbie Lawler, who stopped him with a flying knee in a wild first-round back in 2012. Despite that setback, Amagov rebounded and secured a UFC contract. In 2013, Amagov debuted in the UFC and wasted no time proving himself. He went 2-0, defeating Chris Spang by decision, and then making a huge statement by knocking out TJ Waldburger in brutal fashion at UFC 166. The KO was so vicious that Waldburger had to be taken out on a stretcher, further building the mystique around Amagov's striking power. Despite his momentum and undefeated UFC run, Amagov shocked fans and insiders by retiring abruptly at just 26 years old. He cited fatigue from the demands of weight cutting and a desire to focus on his family. The move puzzled many, as he was seemingly on track to break into the rankings and potentially contend for a title in a stacked welterweight division. His career may have been short, but it was enough to leave a strong impression, highlighted by explosive finishes, elite-level potential, and a striking style that made him a fan favorite among those who knew him. One of the most legendary behind-the-scenes stories in MMA gyms involves a moment that seems almost too wild to believe: Adlan Amagov dropping Jon Jones in sparring. This tale came to light during an episode of the Jackson podcast, where UFC veteran Carlos Condit recalled his time training at the Jackson Wink MMA Academy. While chatting with former UFC light heavyweight champ Quinton Rampage Jackson, Condit was asked if he'd ever seen anyone get the better of Jon Jones during training, a guy often considered the GOAT by fans and UFC president Dana White himself. Condit didn't hesitate. He told the story of a quiet Tuesday morning sparring session when an unfamiliar Chechen fighter showed up, Adlan Amagov. At the time, Amagov was known around the gym for his dangerous spinning attacks and unique striking flow. Condit admitted that Amagov gave him serious problems that day, landing clean, painful shots. But then came the bombshell. Amagov landed a perfectly timed spinning back kick to Jon Jones' liver and dropped him. Condit confirmed it without exaggeration. Jones was sent to the mat by a body shot. The kick wasn't a fluke. It was technique, precision, and timing, delivered by a fighter who, despite not being a household name, had the kind of skills that could humble even the sport's elite. Years later, Amagov himself acknowledged the moment, albeit shyly. He never intended to brag about it, but the story gained traction after Jones traveled to Russia in 2018 and allegedly referenced it himself. Once the story was out, it reignited interest in Amagov and his potential. This moment, though it happened in a closed training environment, became part of MMA folklore. The fact that someone who fought only twice in the UFC managed to floor Jon Jones, one of the most dominant fighters in history, says a lot about Amagov's raw talent. It's a rare glimpse into the kind of things that happen away from the bright lights, where legends can quietly be humbled and lesser-known fighters briefly shine. Adlan Amagov is one of those rare fighters whose name keeps coming up not because of a long, decorated career, but because of what could have been. He's become a symbol of the ultimate MMA what-if, a fighter with elite-level potential who walked away before we ever got to see his full evolution inside the octagon. Amagov had everything you want in a breakout star. His striking style was flashy and crowd-pleasing, filled with unorthodox spinning attacks that landed with power and precision. He possessed legitimate knockout power, a high fight IQ, and a strong base in combat sports like Sambo and Unifight. Add to that his international experience and calm presence in the cage, and you had the makings of a serious contender. And as we now know, even someone as dominant as Jon Jones was not immune to Amagov's skill. He reportedly dropped the UFC champion during a sparring session, a story now cemented in MMA folklore. His sudden retirement in 2013, following 2 dominant UFC performances, left fans stunned. This wasn't a fighter on the decline, plagued by losses or injuries. He wasn't cut from the roster. On the contrary, he was winning and building momentum, yet he chose to walk away. In a sport where most fighters stay in the game well past their prime, Amagov's exit was not only surprising, it was rare. Reports suggest that his retirement was motivated by a combination of grueling weight cuts and a desire to spend more time with his family. Whatever the reason, it was clear that the fire to compete on the big stage wasn't enough to keep him in the grind. He returned once more in 2016 for single bout, which he won by quick submission, then disappeared again. And he was only 26 years old when he stepped away, an age when most fighters are just entering their physical prime. That's part of what makes his story so compelling. Fans and fighters still wonder what could have happened if he'd stayed. Could he have cracked the top 10 in the UFC? Would his unique style have posed problems for big names in the welterweight or middleweight divisions? What heights could he have reached with the right team and promotional push? Because of the flashes of brilliance he showed in such a short span, and the stories that live on from behind closed doors, Adlan Amagov remains one of MMA's greatest what-ifs. He didn't just show potential. He was already there, and that's exactly why his legacy continues to spark fascination all these years later. Adlan Amagov's story doesn't end with a graceful exit from the sport. In fact, after his retirement, things took a darker and more complicated turn. Though he initially stepped away from MMA in 2013 to focus on family and health, the itch to compete never fully left him. In 2016, 3 years after his last UFC appearance, Amagov returned for a final bout at an event in Russia, League S70, Platforma 7th, where he won by submission in the very first round. The performance showed that the talent was still there. It also made fans wonder if this comeback could spark a full return. But that moment turned out to be a brief flash, his last official fight in MMA. Unfortunately, what followed was not a redemption arc or a rise back into the rankings. Instead, Amagov's name began to circulate for all the wrong reasons. Reports emerged that he had been involved in criminal activity, with some outlets stating he allegedly came out of retirement to fight in 2016 in order to settle a mob-related debt. That alone added an unsettling wrinkle to his story, hinting at personal struggles far removed from the cage. Things escalated when Amagov was eventually named as a suspect in a murder case in Russia. According to multiple reports, he is currently wanted by Russian authorities in connection to the killing, though the details remain murky and largely unconfirmed due to limited coverage and the sensitive nature of the case. What is clear, however, is that this development cast a shadow over his fighting legacy. The narrative of Amagov, once a promising rising star who shocked gym legends and retired undefeated in the UFC, suddenly collided with darker realities outside the octagon. It added a tragic, almost cinematic twist to his story. A fighter who had all the tools to be a contender, who trained with legends like Fedor Emelianenko and Khabib Nurmagomedov, now finds his name remembered just as much for what he didn't achieve in MMA as for the path his life took afterward. Despite his relatively short time in the spotlight, Adlan Amagov managed to earn something far more lasting than just a record or a highlight reel: respect from the fighters who trained and competed alongside him. Among those who truly understand the fight game, whether they're coaches, training partners, or seasoned veterans, Amagov's name carries weight. That's rare for someone with only 2 UFC fights under their belt. Fighters like Carlos Condit didn't just casually mention Amagov in passing, they highlighted him as someone who stood out in rooms full of elite talent. His ability to deliver clean, precise, and powerful strikes, especially his trademark spinning back kicks, left a lasting impression on those he sparred with. Jon Jones, arguably the most dominant champion in MMA history, getting dropped by Amagov in training? That alone has become part of gym folklore, and it wasn't told to embarrass Jones, but rather to emphasize just how skilled and dangerous Amagov was. Even Khamzat Chimaev, another Chechen fighter who exploded onto the UFC scene with similar aggression and dominance, has had to deal with comparisons to Amagov. Interestingly, both fighters share the nickname Borz, which means wolf in Chechen, though Amagov had it first. When Chimaev was asked about those comparisons, he acknowledged Amagov's success, but also made it clear that he wanted to carve his own legacy. That's a subtle nod to the impact Amagov had, so strong that even the new wave of fighters felt his presence. Among hardcore MMA fans, Amagov is one of those cult figures, a you-had-to-be-there kind of fighter. The kind of name that sparks debates and nostalgia whenever someone talks about forgotten greats or fighters who retired too early. He's the fighter who never got his title shot, never had his breakout pay-per-view moment, and never had the mainstream fame, but still remains in the conversation because his talent was undeniable to those who saw it. Even though his story veered into chaos and controversy, the legend of Adlan Amagov remains cemented in MMA's underground history. He was a fighter's fighter, a gym legend, and perhaps most painfully, a glimpse of what might have been.